Order!
Si Jesus N.W.T dutsen go masi a junk awe go a tereweg a chulten a kid a unit contact denike a unit on tane go chaka unit no so good digger Karacha Agalaketa uti goods in an eti go heguneta a secutele nesno a unit go hegunuso masi si Jesus N.W.T dutsen go.
Please be seated. Good afternoon, colleagues. Wasn't that a great way to start our sitting? Please join me in thanking the Colekirk Fiddlers for starting things off here today, and especially their great leader, Linda Duford. I also want to thank Sarah Cleary for our opening prayer. Thank you, Masi. Colleagues, we last convened in this chamber on November 3rd, 2022, and it is great to be back. I know that you have been busy with your duties as members, ministers, and with committees. But I hope that everyone had a wonderful holiday season and are feeling refreshed and prepared for this sitting. I know that I am looking forward to it. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to congratulate our Team N.W.T athletes who competed in the 2023 Arctic Winter Games in Alberta. Team N.W.T put on a great performance and brought home many ulus to prove it. I also want to congratulate and say a special thank you to the Fort McPherson Tetlet Gutchin dancers who won the hearts of many with their wonderful performances. Congratulations to all our athletes and performers. Colleagues, I want to thank the pages that will be with us during this sitting. We are fortunate to welcome pages from Wrigley, Inuvik, Hay River, YELLOWKNIFE, N.W.T, Toledo, Fort Smith, and Yellowknife. I have said many times that the youth are our future, and I am proud of our page program, which allows us to bring in youth from across the territory. I am honored and inspired to have our future leaders with us in this chamber. I would also like to thank our interpreters for the incredible work they do for us each and every day. During this sitting, we'll have interpretation into N.W.T, 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 Satuan, Satuotene, Yati, Clicho, and French. It is because of their hard work and dedication that we are able to honor our official languages. Finally, I would like to take a moment to remind each of you, as members of this Legislative Assembly, to conduct yourselves in keeping with our rules and traditions. When we show respect for each other, for this institution, and for our rules, we show respect for those who have elected us to represent them here in this chamber. That doesn't mean we will always agree. We won't. Disagreement, even passionate disagreement, is a part of our job. However, when we disagree, we must do so with the dignity and respect that our people expect from us. Now, colleagues, it is my duty to advise the House that I have received the following message from the Commissioner of the Northwest Territories. It reads, "Dear Mrs. Speaker, I wish to advise that I recommend the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories the passage of Appropriation Act Appropriation Act Operation Expenditures 2023-2024. Supplementary Appropriations Act Infrastructure Expenditures Number 3, 2022-2023. Supplementary Appropriations Act Operation Expenditure Number 3, 2022-2023. And Supplementary Appropriations Act Infrastructure Expenditure Number 1, 2023-2024, during the second session of the 19th Legislative Assembly. Yours truly, Margaret M. Tom, Commissioner. Thank you, colleagues. Minister statements. Minister statements. Minister responsible for Housing, N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to provide an update on Housing Northwest Territories renewal, including some long-awaited changes we have made to the program and policies that are already improving housing supports for the most in need. In June 2021, at the first meeting of the N.W.T Council of Leaders, I stood with my colleague, the Honourable Premier Cochrane, and committed to conducting a review of the former N.W.T. Housing Corporation's policies and programs with a working group identified by the Council. In the short time since that commitment, I was mandated, and I'm pleased to report on some of the results of the important work which has been guided by Housing N.W.T's renewal strategy. First, we made fundamental changes to our mandate. These changes include a commitment to deliver client-focused services and assist those most in need, the recognition that housing plays an important role in the well-being of individuals and communities, and recognizing the strong partnerships are key to improving housing outcomes. With a new mandate in place, Housing N.W.T. has its marching orders to work with the Council of Leaders Housing Working Group and look at policies and programming changes through the lens of the new mandate. Some of the resulting changes include eliminating the need for co-pay for emergency repair to ensure that emergencies are addressed in a timely manner. Working collaboratively with stakeholders and Indigenous governments on the design and location of these units we build. Addressing the higher cost of home repair by increasing the maximum funding amounts for projects funded under these programs. The Emergency Repair Program, Fuel Tank Replacement Program, and the Seniors Aging in Place Program. Changing our approach to community housing planning to recognize the key leadership role N.W.T. Indigenous governments are playing in providing housing supports to their members. Enhancing our support to local housing organizations and associations is our primary partner in the delivery of public housing in communities, with better training and communication, improving tools for tenant education and communication regarding their tenancy agreements. And lastly, working to plan to build and manage our assets in an energy-efficient manner with the energy management strategy and blueprint, the details of which will be announced soon. Housing will also be moving forward with a new pilot program that is expected to offset some of the cost of shipping materials to remote communities. And this is another program that will improve the availability of minor home repair materials where they are difficult to access. Mr. Speaker, the changes guided by Housing N.W.T's renewal are not limited to program and policy. They touch on all areas of Housing N.W.T's work. We have chartered a new path for collaborative work with Indigenous governments, including agreements with the Clecho Government, Satu Secretariat, and with others to follow. We are improving our communication with stakeholders and the public. We are seeking partnership with non-governmental organizations and others like never before. We've seen success in our engagement with the federal government addressing housing priorities. I would like to thank the Council of Leaders and their participants on the Housing Working Group for helping us improve and modernizing Housing N.W.T's mandate. Programs and policies, your contribution have led to a positive change that are already helping us better serve our residents. Our renewal has marked a turning point for the GNWT in how we address the territorial's housing crisis. Mr. Speaker, by providing fair access to quality housing supports for people most in need, I am confident that we will increase the well-being of individuals and communities across the Northwest Territories, as stated in our mandate. I'm proud of the work that we have done this far, and I look forward to the work ahead. I would also like to thank the staff of Housing N.W.T. for working strategically with our communities as well, and also with the feedback that we've received. They've really made a lot of changes within this government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Colleagues, before we continue, I'd just like to welcome our former member and minister, Mr. Lou Siebert. Mr. Siebert was a minister and member in the 18th Legislative Assembly. I'd also like to welcome Mr. David Jones, our Integrity Commissioner. Welcome. Minister statements. Minister statements. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to speak about the devastating impact that the drug poisoning crisis has had on the community of Hay River. The coroner has confirmed that there were 6 deaths related to drug poisoning in 2022. Many families are struggling to understand and to cope with the emotional toll of these deaths. Public health officials have noted that these deaths are drug poisonings rather than overdoses. The difference is that with a drug overdose, someone takes too much of something they know they are taking. But with a drug poisoning, the drug user is not aware their supply is contaminated with opioids. Because of this, we are now calling deaths shown to be related to fentanyl and carfentanil drug poisoning to emphasize the added danger to all people who use illicit drugs. We need to help people understand that if they are taking drugs, they must take precautions. In Hay River, all individuals who died from drug poisoning were alone. None of them had naloxone, a nasal spray which reverses the effects of opioids, and none of them were aware their drug supply was contaminated with fentanyl or carfentanil. Anyone can be at risk of drug poisoning, including people who use illicit drugs for the first time, people who use these drugs recreationally, and people who are frequent or daily users. Mr. Speaker, the Hay River Health and Social Services Authority has been collaborating with community partners on initiatives to prevent poisonings, to help drug users recover and their loved ones to cope with the stress of having a family member who is addicted. To date, the authority has distributed educational posters about naloxone around the community. They have been offering the Matrix program to help people recover from addictions and the Hope for Families workshops. They have created a team comprised of a clinician and a mental health professional to provide outreach services over the next 3 months, and they're ready to support the town's new Social Issues Committee and the Elders Group. In December 2022, a group of healthcare professionals assembled to help respond to this situation. Last month, the Hay River Health and Social Services Authority, along with the Chief Public Health Officer and the N.W.T Chief Coroner, held a news conference in Hay River to raise awareness about the drug poisoning deaths and the presence of fentanyl and carfentanil in the community. The Chief Public Health Officer and her staff also met with community members and service providers to hear their concerns about resource gaps and to identify supports to address the concerns arising from drug use. Mr. Speaker, the health and social services system wants to collaborate with the community to enhance supports and prevent further harms related to drug use. While this situation has reached a crisis point in Hay River, we understand there are many residents who are concerned with a rise in the use of illicit drugs in their communities. We intend to apply the lessons learned in Hay River to address these concerns with them. Mr. Speaker, deaths due to drug poisoning are entirely preventable. My thoughts are with everyone who has lost someone close to them due to the contamination in the illicit drug supply. All residents can support a safer community by learning to recognize the signs of drug poisoning, carrying and knowing how to use naloxone, not mixing drugs, and if using, to start low and slow and not to use alone. It's important to know that you're protected from drug possession charges under the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act if you call 911 for help. And please do call. You may save a life. I ask everyone in the Northwest Territories to help prevent further drug poisoning deaths by treating one another with compassion and understanding as we address this complex issue together. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Minister statements. Minister statements. scattered through. Minister responsible for finance.
Mr. Speaker, I give notice that I will deliver the budget address on Wednesday, February 8th, 2023. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Minister statements. Minister statements. Ministers. Or Deputy Premier, sorry.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to advise the House that the Honourable Caroline Cochrane will be absent from the House for today and tomorrow to attend the First Minister's meeting in Ottawa, Ontario. Queen Naini, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Deputy Premier. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Tlavacha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as we begin the final calendar year of our term, I'd like to start this session by first welcoming back all my colleagues into this chamber. It's good to be back after a winter break and holiday season. I hope all members and staff of the Assembly had a good and restful holiday with their loved ones. Mr. Speaker, for my first statement, I want to share a positive story about a Tlavacha constituent who was recently appointed into a very prestigious new career opportunity. On January the 12th, 2023, the federal government appointed Mr. Ernie Daniels to the board of the Bank of Canada. Ernie is a member of the Salt River First Nation and will serve a 3-year term on the 12-member board of directors. Ernie has over 35 years of senior financial management experience, including serving as president and CEO of the First Nations Finance Authority for 10 years, which is a First Nation governed nonprofit financial institution. In addition, Mr. Speaker, according to a spokesperson from the Bank of Canada, Ernie, to the best of my knowledge, is the very first ever First Nations person to join the bank's board. And as someone who has known Ernie all his life and have worked with him many times over the years, I can attest that he is a very driven, bright, and dedicated individual. I know he will excel as a director with the Bank of Canada. Mr. Speaker, this appointment is not only a milestone for Indigenous people, but it respects a significant occasion for all of Canada. On behalf of the constituents of Tlavacha and the people of the N.W.T, I want to congratulate Mr. Ernie Daniels on his achievement of being appointed to the Board of Directors on the Bank of Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Tlavacha. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Hay River has and continues to have its fair share of substance abuse issues, which has been driven home by the number of drug-related deaths in this last year. Mr. Speaker, for those who are no longer with us, we grieve. For those who find themselves fighting a losing battle, we hear their cry for help. But are we as government listening? That cry is becoming louder, and it is not more studies they are asking for, it is not more reports they are asking for, and it is not more discussions they are asking for. What is being asked for is a safe place to detox with proper assessment and support. Mr. Speaker, I am certain that we all know someone who is struggling with substance abuse, whether it be a family member, a friend, or that random person we pass on the street. Substance abuse has no qualms about who it engages and who it hurts. I hear more people in the community talking about never feeling so unsafe. I hear of children who are scared to go to the school bus stop because of the ongoing traffic to known drug houses. I hear of elders being coerced out of money by family members who are looking to buy drugs. I hear of persons' lives being threatened because of drug deaths. This is the reality we are living in within our communities. Mr. Speaker, the issue and impact of substance abuse in our communities, whether it be illicit drugs or alcohol, will not go away. But that does not mean we give up and do nothing. I have constituents come into my office who are addicted to drugs or alcohol. I had known drug dealers attend my office who are addicts themselves and scared for their lives. All are looking for a way out, but find that the resources needed are not there, not complete, and not immediate. Mr. Speaker, we have no infrastructure or workable mechanisms in place to help those that are seeking detox support. They are told they need to be clean for 24 hours. They are told there are no available beds when they go to the hospital. They are told there are no trained addiction staff, workers on the floor. They are told access to treatment facilities is weeks and most likely months away. Mr. Speaker, it is time for the Minister of Health to make detox beds and qualified detox staff a priority, as I'd rather visit my friends, relatives, and constituents at a detox or treatment center than attend their funeral. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Haver South. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Over recent months, my office has done a lot of work on behalf of tenants and public housing units in the Lanky Court apartment complex in my riding. It's been a long and very difficult process to get responses from the Housing Minister on behalf of the Yellowknife Housing Authority, working with Northview Apartment Real Estate Investment Trust. More importantly, actual improvements to housing conditions do not seem to have materialized. There have been cockroach and bedbug infestations and housing conditions no one should have to endure. Young children being repeatedly attacked by bedbugs, mold so bad that it is causing breathing problems for tenants, public housing tenants forced to pay moving costs and service connection charges when they are moved within the complex, and more. At least one constituent finally moved out as there were no solutions being offered. One constituent first came to my office about a bed bug infestation and inaction from the landlord on dealing with the pests. To combat the pests, this tenant had to treat or throw out all furnishings, clean the apartment thoroughly, and pack up household effects while the chemical treatment was actually underway. For a low-income person, action packers, cleaning products, and new furniture are unaffordable and were not provided. Compounding the pest problem was mold rot in the bath and kitchen area, requiring extensive repairs. Through long and persistent lobbying, I got the constituent moved into another apartment while repairs took place on their unit. That seemed like a good solution, Mr. Speaker, until I learned recently that the new apartment was already infested with cockroaches. I have also been informed that the tenant would not be moving back to the renovated and pest-controlled unit. The constituent was also charged $400 for moving furnishings and personal effects, and would be charged the fee for transferring their electrical account. It's hard to believe, Mr. Speaker, that we treat people in this manner. Looking at the core housing need and other data from the Bureau of Statistics, we see that these horrible conditions are commonplace across the Northwest Territories. 10% of all houses are considered inadequate, which in some smaller communities goes as high as 50%. Pests, mold rot, and bad indoor air are so commonplace that the Bureau of Statistics actually compiles separate data tables on these problems by community. The root of the problem is this government's inability or unwillingness to provide adequate housing for all our residents. Housing is not a priority with this government when we continue to spend more on roads than on housing and travel to Ottawa for mega projects over housing. I'll have questions for the Housing Minister later today. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Detroit.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to recognize a few participants from my constituency who were chosen for the 2023 Arctic Winter Games. The Games were recently held in Fort McMurray, Alberta, January 29th to February 4th. It's not often that we see any participants at the Arctic Winter Games from the smaller centres. We shed joy and tears when they do happen. Although we did not get any participants from N.W.T First Nations, Kakiza, nor Enterprise, we did have 4 participants from Fort Providence. Christina Bonadouche participated as one of the badminton coaches for Team Northwest Territories. She will also attend the Canada Games in the next few weeks. Christina, who plays badminton, attended Arctic Winter Games in 2014 and 2016, North American Indigenous Games 2014, Western Summer Games 2015, and the Canada Winter Games in 2015. Christina has won the Aboriginal Sports Circle Award in 2014 and the Scott McAdam Youth Leadership Award in 2018. She is very keen to continue coaching, and we wish nothing but success for our own Christina. Thorsten Gold, who is stationed and lives in Fort Providence, is the table tennis coach for Northwest Territories, or Team Northwest Territories. Thorsten is also the sports chair for the table tennis event for the Art Winter Games held in Fort McMurray. In this position, Thorsten assisted with the purchase of equipment and training officials to run the event. Thorsten was also able to run the media and communication outlets for Hockey N.W.T and Table Tennis North. This allowed for the promotion of athletes, sharing stories, and ensuring the amazing experiences of our athletes were shared. We thank Thorsten for his contributions to readying the athletes for participation at the Art Winter Games. Two of our younger table tennis athletes were a brother and sister team made up of Carissa and Carter Sadowich. Carissa, 9 years old, Carter, 11 years old, were part of a group of the younger athletes at these games. Their parents, grandparents, and our community are so proud they made Team Northwest Territories. I am certain this will not be the last games for Carissa and Carter. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Dead Cho. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Happy New Year, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to welcome yourself, my colleagues, the interpreters, and all of our staff back for a constructive and productive winter session, and for the last term of our Assembly. Or last year, sorry. Mr. Speaker, I hope you had a wonderful break full of rest, relaxation, and time spent with family. I wish this was the case for all the residents of the territory. However, for many of my constituents and others, there was no break from the daily struggle of surviving. With soaring fuel and electricity rates, escalating rent and grocery prices, most residents are living paycheck to paycheck, and many are having to make the hard decision between paying a bill or their rent and having food on the table. Further compounding their woes is the quality of housing that is available in our territory. When you spend excessive amounts of your money on rent and all you receive in return is a moldy, pest-infested apartment with sketchy heating and people smoking crack in the hallways, it's extremely demoralizing. Mr. Speaker, several of these apartments are in my riding, and several more exist throughout the city. Windows are broken and boarded up. Fire extinguishers are set off on a regular basis. Mold is present and raw sewage is leaking. And many are often without heat. Mr. Speaker, it often takes months for any response to my questions. And when I do get one, they are often vague and lacking details. I asked for the plan to move residents into Nordic Arms, purchased by the department a year ago this month, and was told sometime after the renovations are complete, which appears to be slated for April 2023. However, when I requested the sequencing plan to accommodate the renos and move in the residents, it appears to me there isn't one. Mr. Speaker, when is this minister going to do anything for my constituents and others in the territory? Where are all these units she has continuously promised? Where are the contracts with NGOs to run the shelters in Yellowknife and Inuvik? Imagine my surprise, Mr. Speaker, to recently learn that the highly anticipated homelessness strategy, a priority to all 19 of us, and promised for April 2023 last session, isn't even being led by the housing minister anymore. Rather, this critical and desperately needed strategy and subsequent action is now being led by the Premier and EIA. What does this say about the state of the strategy that in the 11th hour, the N.W.T feels it's better for a whole new minister and staff to execute it rather than the department where the expertise supposedly lies? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Great Slave. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Mumfwee.
See, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, what I am going to talk about is regarding housing in the Clinchon region, Betchakowati, Gamati, and Wikwiti. And I'm going to talk about the rental prices. There's a lot of people that has debts with their rentals and the whole process of rating their monthly rent. And sometimes some of these people are evicted from their units. I will be talking about that today. But today, I want to talk about people's arrear and what happens to them in the future if they were to ask for a new rental again. So these are some of the questions I will be bringing forward. I have so many concerns from my constituents regarding this. And also, it is also rated with your last year's taxes, the amount of money that they made the previous year it's based on what they pay this year. Sometimes this year the person is not working, and some of them are saying that they're paying over $1,000 a month with no income. So I will talk about that and ask questions.
Priorities as the member of Clecho region is to ensure that each resident in Betchako, N.W.T, Y.E.LLOWKNIFE, and N.W.T has access to affordable housing. Mr. Speaker, one of the barriers to accessing affordable housing is arrears. Residents have experienced evictions from public housing units due to arrears and are ineligible to reapply for public housing until those arrears are paid off. Mr. Speaker, far too often the conversations is focused on what arrears are owed and not why arrears have accumulated. Mr. Speaker, my constituents have shared with me many reasons they have accumulated arrears that reflect the economic realities of the Northwest Territories, not the desire for someone to pay their rent on time. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, can I have a unanimous consent to conclude my statement? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Mumfway. The member is seeking unanimous consent to conclude her statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Mr. Speaker, my constituents have shared with me many reasons they have accumulated arrears that reflect the economic realities of the Northwest Territories, not the desire for someone to pay their rent on time. Mr. Speaker, I assure you that residents want to be able to pay their rent. Mr. Speaker, many of my constituents rely on seasonal employment and therefore lack consistent or stable income. Currently, the practice of the local housing authority is to use the Government of Canada Notice of Assessment to verify income and determine a tenant's rent. Tenants are not given options for income verification that reflect the economic realities of the North and reliance on seasonal employment. Mr. Speaker, many elders have expressed they have not had respectful or meaningful communication to verify their income, which results in arrears. Additional accommodation need to be made for elders. Housing staff at the LHO level need additional training in culturally respectful communication and encouragement to meet elders in their homes or places they are comfortable, not insist elders go to N.W.T or to LHO offices. Mr. Speaker, housing N.W.T verification of income policy states, quote, annual or periodic verification is required. Housing N.W.T need to develop an option for tenants to use verification of income methods. Given the high number of people who are seasonally employed, a verification of income would respond to employment and income status at a given time. With more accurate income verification, arrears could be reduced in the long term because people would be able to pay their rent. According to the latest housing annual report, Housing N.W.T has accumulated millions in dollars over the years in arrears. This is a serious accumulation of arrears that indicates poor housing N.W.T management and not the decision of individual rent. I will have a question for the Minister of Housing. Thank you.
Colleagues, before we continue, I'd just like to remind members, when you seek unanimous consent, usually it's to finish your statement, but because it's the first day, I'll let this slide. But when we continue, once you seek unanimous consent, usually you have 30 seconds to, actually I'll just explain. When you're starting in your official language and you switch to English, you actually get 30 more seconds. And then if you seek unanimous consent, that's another 30, but that's to finish your statement, not the whole 2.5 minutes. But like I said, today's the first day. Well, going on, we'll just be mindful of others. Thanks. Okay, member statements. Member statements, member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise in the House to pay my respects to the communities in my riding who lost loved ones since November 2022. My home community of Tuktoyaktuk, Mr. Speaker, we lost one of our respected elders, retired long-time employee, Hamlet of Tuktoyaktuk, mechanic, Mr. Churchill Wilkie Sr. His wife Dorothy Wilkie, sons Churchill, Charlton, Brent, and daughters Emma and Shelley, and many grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and beloved brothers and sisters, our thoughts and prayers are with you. Mr. Speaker, YELLOWKNIFE, Angus Elias, young man, husband of Gail, father's his grandson of Albert and Shirley Elias, our thoughts and prayers are with you. George YELLOWKNIFE, beloved elder, retired, long-time employee of the Hamlet of YELLOWKNIFE, wife Connie YELLOWKNIFE, and many grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and other family members, our thoughts and prayers. The community of Polituk, Mr. David Rubin, beloved elder, respected by many in the N.W.T, one of the last who used dog teams as a livelihood as a young man, Mr. Speaker. Also, my nephew, Travis Coyne. Thoughts and prayers go to Marianne and Josh in Whitehorse, Yukon, and my sister, who's there right now with them, thinking of them, and our thoughts and prayers are with them all, Mr. Speaker, and all who lost loved ones across our territory and across the north. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for the N.W.T. Our thoughts and prayers are with your community and the whole region. I know we suffered a lot of losses throughout the holidays, and our thoughts and prayers are with the families and throughout the territory as well. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Tunade-Welde.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was elected on February 10th, 2022 on by-election for the Tunade-Welde riding. In October 2019, the newly elected MLA's members went to a retreat to bring forward all their goals and mandates for the respective communities from this retreat. The N.W.T tabled their 4-year mandate plan, and it has been 1 year on February 10th, 2022, I was elected as the MLA for Tunade riding. Not one minister, not one deputy minister, or the premier approached me on the needs and wants for my riding. Despite I made every effort to work with cabinet to be heard, but no meeting took place to my request to date. As the MLA for my riding, I'm sitting on committees on various overall government operation, and from what I could see, this government is status quo, and the departments are moving forward with their 4-year mandate with no consultation or accommodation with my riding on the community needs and infrastructure projects. Again, this government knows best on what is needed in all communities in N.W.T, including my riding. I raised my constituent issues with the Premier, Cabinet, and Minister in the fall session, where I said the train left the station and there was no way to throw on constituent issues and baggage onto the moving train with the door closed. So it doesn't matter what I say or do. This government wants me to support the 2023-24 budget with no consultation or accommodation for the communities in my riding is deeply concerning. In the 2022-23 budget, the N.W.T allocated $3.4 million for public housing repairs. On April 14, 2022, Northern Affairs Canada announced a $60 million federal housing dollars to address the urgent housing crisis in N.W.T, and allocation to be determined. The housing crisis allocation was determined and decided by the N.W.T Housing Corporation at the time to use the $30 million that Indigenous money to fix up public housing units and assets. They did not address the real housing crisis promised in their public announcement for all 33 communities in Northwest Territories. In the 2023-24 fiscal year budget, N.W.T will be spending another $30 million for CERNAC dollars, again to fix up public housing units. I'll be asking the Premier Minister to work with the Indigenous government to allocate the $30 million through a contribution agreement so Indigenous governments can address their own housing crisis. Mr. Speaker, I will have answers for the Minister at the appropriate time. Merci.
Thank you, Member for Trinity-Welde. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for over a decade, Canadians have acknowledged the growing shortage of speech-language pathologists, especially in school settings. These services are critical for all children to access education equitably. The deficit is due in part to the limited number of openings in graduate programs and the increased need for speech-language pathologists as their scope of practice widens, rates of neurodivergent children grows, and classrooms play catch-up in a post-pandemic world. Also, we have an aging population. This national shortage impacts education outcomes in the N.W.T and was recognized as an N.W.T specific concern by the 2020 Office of the Auditor General's report on education. The audit concluded that in the decade since its previous education audit, that education, culture, and employment had, quote, improved its support for delivering inclusive schooling, but more work was required, end quote, and that the department did not provide, quote, adequate guidance and training for support assistance, end quote, and adding, quote, the needs of all students were not being met. Mr. Speaker, low staffing levels have continued to force Health and Social Services to reorganize its service delivery of speech-language services. But we aren't the only jurisdiction experiencing high demand and low staffing for speech-language services. Our sister territory, Nunavut, experienced the same and has creatively addressed this through a partnership with Ongo-Miswin Health Services through the University of Manitoba. Through this partnership, they provide occupational therapy, speech-language pathology, and physiotherapy to all students in Nunavut. Referrals are sent directly from the schools to the Department of Education, which then works with the Ongo-Miswin coordinator. Schools receive 1 to 2 in-person therapist visits throughout the school year, and between visits, therapists provide virtual support via video conferencing with the students or ongoing support through constant email contact between teachers and therapists. In the N.W.T, last year's wait times to access speech services ranged from 2 months in Fort Smith to half a year or more in Yellowknife. 6 months is more than half of a school year, Mr. Speaker. This is far too long for students to wait for services critical to equitable access to education. Our children cannot wait for a decade-long shortage to right itself. This government needs to look at creative solutions like community-based paraprofessionals, funded teletherapies, and partnerships that work for teachers in the child's best interest. Without these innovative solutions, the needs of N.W.T students will continue to go unmet. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all know we're in a health crisis, and getting a doctor to see a doctor is harder and harder. And there are many steps we can take, but one I would like to speak about today is giving our pharmacists who go to school for many years and quite frankly often know the drugs they are prescribing better than the doctors themselves, the ability to prescribe basic medications. This is a recommended practice by Health Canada. All 10 provinces will be able to provide this service in 2023. Including the Yukon, but here in the Northwest Territories, we have fallen far behind in what our pharmacists are capable of doing. There is a recommended list of minor ailments that Health Canada recommends pharmacists can prescribe, as well as the limited ability to renew certain prescriptions. They estimate that this reduces emergency room visits by 35%, Mr. Speaker. Emergency room visits are vastly more expensive than a visit to the pharmacist. At this point, Mr. Speaker, almost every other jurisdiction in Canada has done this. I will have questions for the Minister of Health of when we can introduce changes to our Pharmacy Act and give a long-needed power to our pharmacists to help their clients. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Nahende.
Mr. Cho, Mr. Speaker. This past weekend, I had the pleasure of attending and refereeing the Paul Stipdonk Memorial Soccer Tournament. It was the first time since the pandemic canceled the last couple of years. As I stated previously in this House, this tournament is a bit unique in that we don't keep score, teams are mixed up, and we do not have a winner or loser. The focus is on youth having fun and playing the sport, something the namesake was all about. Besides playing the sport, the youth were given the opportunity to attend a skills competition event on Saturday. This year, we had athletes from Sumbakay and Fort Simpson. They were great sportsmen and ambassadors of their respected communities. It was amazing to see all their smiling faces and the fun they had over the weekend. I'm proud to say that Fort Simpson youth were great hosts and really enjoyed the games as they made new friends from the region. I was proud to say that parents and family of the athletes, whether they were from the community or from out of town, did an amazing job cheering and encouraging the youth. It was awesome to see the stands and the hall full of supporters. Mr. Speaker, a special shout out goes to the Mackenzie Recreation Association, Municipal and Community Affairs, the Village of Fort Simpson Recreation staff who kept the facility nice and clean, and most importantly, Rosalind Firth and Jacqueline Welly who dedicated many hours of organizing and making sure the event ran smoothly. To the speed skater's mom, thank you for catering the whole weekend. I would like to thank the Fort Simpson High Performance athletes for being the coaches of the teams, helpers, and being great role models to the youth. It was great to see this capacity being built. I take great pride when I see young athletes paying back to the sport. In closing, I'd like to use the words provided by one of the organizers. A big special thank you to the Stipdonk family for letting us to honor their husband, dad, grandfather, and friend in a way that brings so many smiles to the youth. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to encourage my colleagues to give them a big round of applause. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Nahende. Member statements. Member statements. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to welcome my new constituency assistant, Maggie Mercredi, to the chamber. Maggie is a longtime constituent of Great Slave, both as a youngster and currently, and I'm very excited to have her working with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, member for Great Slave. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize a constituent of mine, Louis Siebert. He's also a friend of mine, even though he ran against me in the last election. I also want to recognize the Cole Crook Fiddlers and thank them for being here today, and especially Noah Coop, who is one of my constituents' son. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Thabacha. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Haver South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd also like to recognize Cole Crook Fiddlers, and I'd like to recognize, even though they're not here, they were here, Samara Wilson, Jackson Fuller, Claire Engen, Linda Dufert, Darcy Delorier, Nevaeh Beck, and also from Yellowknife, I guess, Gerda Hazenberg. I'd also like to recognize Mr. Lou Siebert, a previous MLA, and a fellow lawyer as well. And he could just as well be sitting here next to me, and I wouldn't mind it. Thank you.
Thank you, member for Haver South. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Cam Lake is very proud to have a few pages joining us this week. We have Christine White, Ryder Jensen, and Sarah Mercer that are representing Cam Lake as pages in the House. So thank you very much.
Thank you, member for Cam Lake. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize the fiddlers today as well, too. I'd like to recognize Lucas Tucho of Delaney and Emerson Stewart of Toledo. I'd also like to welcome Mr. Louis Siebert as well. I did have the opportunity of meeting him when I did work for Department of Lands. He did visit the Sawtoo as Minister responsible for Department of Lands. Masi. Thank you.
Thank you. Member for Sawtoo. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your committee would like to report on its consideration of Bill 62, an act to amend the Income Tax Act. Bill 62 received second reading in the Legislative Assembly on November 2nd, 2022, and was referred to the Standing Committee on Government Operations for review. The Standing Committee held a public hearing and clause review on January 18th, 2023. Mr. Speaker, the committee reports that Bill 62, an act to amend the Income Tax Act, is ready for consideration in Committee of the Whole. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Yellowknife North. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Reports of standing and special committees. Reports of standing and special committees. Member for Yellowknife North.
Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Thabacha, that Committee Report 38-19, Sub 2, the Standing Committee on Government Operations Report on the review of Bill 62, an act to amend the Income Tax Act, be received and adopted by the Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Yellowknife North. Thank you. Member for Yellowknife North.
Well, after I read this report, I hope you'll accept it. Standing Committee on Government Operations report on Bill 62, an act to amend the Income Tax Act, number 2. Bill 62, an act to amend the Income Tax Act, number 2, received second reading on November 2nd, 2022, and was referred to the Standing Committee on Government Operations for review. Bill 62 would amend the Income Tax Act to harmonize this legislation with the federal government as required under the Canada Northwest Territories Tax Collection Agreement. Specifically, Bill 62 allows the Canada Revenue Agency to share N.W.T specific taxpayer data with Finance Canada to support better tax policy design and analysis, removes federally repealed provisions used to address various COVID-19 relief measures, and ensures the Income Tax Act is consistent with federal provisions and complies with the Northwest Territories Tax Collection Agreement. Committee accepts request to amend. On January 16, 2023, the Government of the Northwest Territories informed committee that it was seeking additional changes to Bill 62. After the N.W.T introduced Bill 62, the Department of Finance discovered the effective dates contained in the bill do not agree with the corresponding measures in the federal tax legislation that had a different retroactive effective dates. Without the proper effective dates, the Canada Revenue Agency would be non-compliant with the Income Tax Act when administering the territorial income tax regime. Originally, Clause 13 of Bill 62 proposed, subject to subsections 2 to 5, this act comes into force on assent. Subsection 5.1 is deemed to have come into force on January 1st, 2018. Subsection 5.2 is deemed to have come into force November 30th, 2020. Section 7 is deemed to have come into force March 25th, 2020. Section 12 is deemed to have come into force March 25th, 2020. To correct the coming into force dates, the department drafted a proposed motion that read that Bill 62 be amended by deleting Clause 13 and substituting the following. 13 sub 1. Subject to sections 2 to 6, this act has to have come into force January 1st, 2022. 13 sub 2. Subsection 4 is deemed to have come into force January 1st, 2023. 13 sub 3. Subsection 5 sub 1 is deemed to have come into force January 1st, 2018. 13 sub 4, subsection 5 sub 2 is deemed to have come into force July 1st, 2021. Sub 5, section 7 is deemed to have come into force March 25th, 2020. Section 8 is deemed to have come into force March 25th, 2020. In response to questions, the Minister of Finance said there would be no delays in bringing forward these proposed amendments. She further explained that the need for retroactive dates were a result of delays in federal changes, the details of which she would try to find and provide separately to committee. The Minister also said that there was no lost revenues to the N.W.T because of these changes. Committee was satisfied with the rationale for the changes and the wording of the motion. Therefore, committee agreed to and passed the motion with the concurrence of the Minister of Finance during its public hearing and clause-by-clause review on January 18, 2022. Bill 62 to allow disclosure on cost of N.W.T tax credits. During the public hearing, the Minister of Finance expressed her understanding that Bill 62 would allow the federal government to disclose the fiscal costs of the territory's tax credits. At present, neither the main estimates nor the public accounts report on the revenue loss from most territorial tax credits. Only a few tax credits, the carbon tax offset, the cost of living offset, and the N.W.T child benefit, are reported. More than a dozen others, such as the N.W.T political tax contribution tax credit, the disability amount, and the dividend tax credit, appear to be unreported. At committee's review of the 2020-21 public accounts, the Comptroller General suggested that the federal government does not provide the Department of Finance with disaggregated data on tax credits. It reported that the federal government collects territorial income tax, distributes territorial tax credits, and returns the net tax revenues to the government of the Northwest Territories. This situation may imply that the Department of Finance cannot access information to assess the effectiveness and efficiency of territorial tax credits. The committee wants to see more public disclosure on the cost of each territorial tax credit. Enhanced disclosure could inform better tax and fiscal policymaking. It would also correct a significant fiscal reporting gap to improve transparency and accountability to taxpayers. The committee welcomes the ways Bill 62 will allow the federal government and the Department of Finance to disclose more information on territorial tax credits. Conclusion. The committee reports Bill 62 as amended to the Legislative Assembly as ready for consideration in Committee of the Whole. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Member for Yellowknife North.
Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Thabacha, that the Committee Report 38-19 Sub 2, the Standing Committee on Government Operations Report on the review of Bill 62, an act to amend the Income Tax Act, be received and adopted by the Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. The motion is in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favour? All those opposed? Any abstentions? The motion is carried. Committee report has been received and adopted by the Assembly. Reports of standing and special committees. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your Committee on Economic Development and Environment is pleased to provide the report of prevention and management contaminated sites commends into the House. The Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment Committee identified contaminated sites as a priority of the committee to focus through the life of the 19th Assembly. Committee focuses to ensure that the Northwest Territories is well positioned to prevent environmental liabilities and effectively manage contaminated work sites. To guide committee in the review of contaminated sites, several stakeholders included several briefings from the government and Northwest Territories. As a result, the review committee has provided several recommendations to the government of Northwest Territories. Intent purpose was to improve prevention, management of contaminated sites in the Northwest Territories. Mr. Speaker, recommendation number 1, the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment recommends that the government of Northwest Territories create a mandatory legislative requirement for companies to operate and approve closure reclamation plans on regularly reviewed and updated to appropriate adjustments to financial security. Recommendation number 2, the Committee on Economic Development and Environment recommends that the N.W.T keep closure reclamation tools up to date and publicly available to ensure the N.W.T is collecting enough security to reflect true cost of a closure and reclamation. Recommendation number 3, the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment recommends that the N.W.T interdepartmentally communities and their existing community-based monitoring programs align monitoring efforts with the surveillance programs required under regulatory permits and licenses. Recommendation number 4, the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment recommends that the N.W.T has internal expertise to inform regulatory decision-making and inspection capability to prevent further public liabilities. Recommendation number 5, the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment recommends that they expand the approach of contaminated sites guidance documents to ensure policies and process are in place to prevent future environmental liabilities, most significantly projects that result with peripheral care. Solutions, further policy guidance with respect on public disclosure are as required. Recommendation number 6, the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment and N.W.T internal capacity of effective early warning system to prevent further public liabilities and approach with require clear measures to prevent perpetual care situations, including mandatory financial security and regulatory reviewed and to be adjusted. Recommendation number 7, the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment, the N.W.T, ensure legislation is clear, appropriate timelines, remediation, reclamation, and inactive suspended well sites. Recommendation number 8, the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment recommends that the N.W.T study the Government of Saskatchewan institutional control program to develop a model, an N.W.T model to better implement the polluter pays principle, that the long-term unforeseen remediation of mining sites while providing regulatory certainty to respect the industry relinquishment, and the N.W.T model should be developed by the end of this 19th Assembly. Recommendation number 9, the committee recommends that Development Environment Committee N.W.T implement transparent and clear process to ensure securities to established, reviewed, and coordinated among various departments. Recommendation number 10, the Standing Committee of Economic Development and Environment, the N.W.T review all legislative requirements regarding the form of financial security to environmental compliance remediation to ensure financial security and most irrecoverable, absolute, and unconditional. Recommendation number 11, the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment recommends that the N.W.T undertake immediate review of oil and gas spills, debris, liabilities, regulations to ensure the absolute liability caps are increased fully, implement the polluter pays principle, reflect the best practice, and protect the public from the liabilities. This review of the increases of caps to be implemented before the end of the 19th Assembly. Recommendation number 12, the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment recommends that they make financial security information, including operator of land, water related securities, amounts, location of project, form of the security expiry dates public through a website that is public confidence in resource management. Recommendation number 13, the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment recommends the Department of Finance provide a plan with timelines to enhance reporting of the N.W.T environmental liabilities and dashboard by matching reporting practices to the Treasury Board of Canada, Secretariat's Federal Contaminant Sites Inventory. Recommendation number 14, the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment develop a plan to budget to schedule a better community support and management of landfills includes training, capacity building, best practices in waste management, diversion, backhaul related matters, and a plan to develop by the end of the 19th Assembly. Recommendation number 15, the Standing Committee on Development, Economic Development and Environment recommends to explore partnerships with industry and industry associations to provide hands-on practical training for landfill managers across our territory. Recommendation number 16, the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment recommends the N.W.T provide a response with these recommendations within 120 days. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for N.W.T. Reports of standing and special committees. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move, second by the honourable member from the Decho, that the committee report 39-19(2) deemed read and printed and answered in its entirety. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for N.W.T. Motion is in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favour? All those opposed? Any abstentions? The motion is carried. Committee report 13-19(2) is deemed read and will be printed and answered. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move, second by the honourable member from the Decho, the committee report 39-19(2) Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment report the prevention and management of contaminated sites be received and moved into the Committee of the Whole for further consideration. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for N.W.T. Motion is in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favour? All those opposed? Any abstentions? The motion is carried. Committee report The committee report has been received and will be moved into Committee of the Whole for further consideration. Reports of standing and special committees. Reports of standing and special committees. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Minister responsible for Housing N.W.T.
Mr. Speaker, I have a return to oral questions asked by the member for Great Slave on October 13, 2022 regarding homelessness. The current data count for homelessness in the territory are from 2019 and show that a total of 1,585 Northwest Territories residents have experienced homelessness at some time in their life. In April 2021, the homelessness hub, YELLOWKNIFE, conducted a point-in-time count and found 312 individuals experience homelessness in Yellowknife. The N.W.T has only done counts as part of a specific project, and we do not currently have a systematic collection of data on the population to allow us to track the population over time. Not only does this make it difficult for me to tell you how many N.W.T residents are impacted at this point, but it also means that I do not have the data on how long the individuals remain homeless and what kind of housing solutions they move into. As social departments have worked together, they have noted the need for better data collection to support the work of these clients. It was recently reaffirmed by meetings with my colleagues from the provincial and territories at the recent Ministers of Housing meeting that the issue we are facing in the Northwest Territories are being faced in all jurisdictions of Canada. Excuse me, sorry. We have learned that there are a variety of approaches being taken in other jurisdictions, ranging from taking innovative approaches to collaborate programs and services delivered by vulnerable populations to changing the architectural of government departments. All efforts recognizing that improving access to programs and services is required to meaningfully to address homelessness. Similar to other jurisdictions, Government of the Northwest Territories' response to homelessness has been challenged by unclear lines of accountability, a patchwork funding source, an ad hoc policy approach, and a lack of dedicated human resources. Homelessness is a multi-phase challenge that requires a whole-of-a-government approach. Announcements from the federal government on the Reaching Home strategy have identified a territory funding stream of $43 million to address the cause of and solutions to homelessness in the Northwest Territories. The Reaching Home strategy was designed to support the goal of the National Housing Strategy and to reduce the chronic homelessness nationally by 50%. The City of Yellowknife is receiving a total of $6 million over 5 years for homelessness programming. Reaching Home also currently provides funding to the Nunavut Regional Corporation, N.W.T government, and the Clecho government. In addition to the Reaching Home funds, I am pleased to be able to say that some of the projects funded under the National Co-Investment Fund from Canada are also targeted to supporting vulnerable populations. Examples of these are included in Yellowknife, an additional 21 unit under construction at Lynn's Place, and the renovation of 41 units at Spruce Bow, and the creation of 14 units at the Family Support Center in Hay River. These projects are just the beginning of some of the investment that will benefit the vulnerable persons across the Northwest Territories. Homelessness is a very complex issue and truly makes changes we need to work closely together with other social envelope departments to generate solutions and develop client-centered and focused approaches. That necessarily collaboration work is now underway. We believe taking a bit more time will provide us with the opportunity to develop a more cohesive whole-of-government approach. As noted in the response to the question earlier, this sitting in the House, I've committed to providing a strategy regarding homelessness on or before April 1st, 2023. This will allow the strategy to represent the intergovernmental nature of responding to homelessness instead of a focus just on housing N.W.T's response. We also recognize that the engagement with our partners, including non-governmental organizations, Indigenous governments, and community governments, will be necessary to further advance this work on this issue. I expect that this engagement will continue and further inform work during early this summer. As you have heard myself and my colleagues speak in the House, we recognize that addressing homelessness is more than just housing N.W.T or health and social services responsibility, and therefore our strategy must focus on the multi-faced response. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Returns to oral questions. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a return to oral question asked by the member for Cam Lake on October 27th, 2022, regarding infertility treatment. To answer the member's question as to who decides what conditions are covered as medically necessary insured health service, it is not, unfortunately, a simple answer. There are multiple factors that come together to determine what is deemed a medically necessary insured service. While the Canada Health Act sets out the principles of its Medicare system, specifically the principles of universality, portability, and accessibility, it is the provincial and territorial healthcare insurance plan administrators who work with their respective physician groups and across jurisdictions to identify a set of services that each jurisdiction accepts as medically necessary insured service provided by physicians and in hospitals. This common set of services allows Canadians to have access to the same suite of services no matter where they live in the country. Of course, each province and territory can cover additional services that are not universally insured across the country. These services are only available as an insured service to the residents of that jurisdiction. In the N.W.T, we cover additional services such as eye examinations and rehab services, which are not services covered in other jurisdictions. In cases of infertility, when an underlying medical condition is identified as the probable cause of the infertility, treatment of that underlying condition is covered under the N.W.T healthcare plan as an insured health service. Where the cause of infertility is not readily known, These cases may be submitted to the medical advisor for review of the specifics of the case and decision. This process, referred to as prior approval, is used in situations where detection and treatment of a potential underlying condition may be outside of the health and social services system's usual referral pathway, or in circumstances that warrant further examination. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Return to oral questions. Return to oral questions. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Haver South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I talked about detox beds and the importance of them in all communities, not only Hay River. Just before we came into the building here, I had a call from somebody who was, asked me if I could take them to the health center in Hay River because they want to detox. But whenever I've done it in the past, and whenever I do it, it's usually, we don't have a bed, or they don't seem to have the qualified staff there. So we need a mechanism, I guess, whether it's through legislation or something, to also be able to kind of hold a person, for a number of days, as we do with mental health, to help them along to detox. But Mr. Speaker, the question I have is for the Minister of Health, and I'd like her to tell me how many dedicated detox beds are available in Hay River. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Haver South. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to start by saying that not everybody with addictions needs hospital-based detox. For example, somebody who has an opioid use addiction can be treated as an outpatient with an opioid antagonist therapy, which is a medication-based therapy. So there isn't a need in that case for someone to be in hospital. The really key time that people need hospital detox is in the withdrawal from alcohol, which can produce life-threatening symptoms. So the Hay River Health and Social Services Authority does not have dedicated detox beds, but they certainly can be made available when a health practitioner assesses the patient and decides that inpatient detox is the preferred option to take. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Haver South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that answer. However, when somebody comes to me and they ask me to take them somewhere, they want to detox, I've got to respond, and I've got to try and help them, because it could be between, a matter between life and death. So, to say that not all people require a bed in the hospital to detox is maybe correct. And I agree there's other forms, but I think it's important that, we have those places available, and I find that in the community, we need them. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister tell me the number of staff available at the Hay River Health Centre who are actually qualified to deal with persons seeking detox support? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Haver South. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the MLA for the engagement he has with this issue in his community. I am very pleased that he gets calls directly and can provide the information that he has and I'm providing. So there are all frontline registered nurses are qualified to administer and support medical detox under the direction of a physician. And that applies to opioids and alcohol. So the starting point is to go to the health center and to be assessed for the substance that the person wants to detox from, and the process unrolls from there. There are always registered nurses at the health center who can provide this assistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Haver South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, I appreciate that answer. You know, I understand that there are staff there. I understand they all have qualifications. But at the end of the day, when somebody goes in there, they don't only need medical treatment, they also need, you know, support from counselors as well. And because what I find is that it's difficult sometimes for a person to actually stay there. They're looking for ways to leave the facility, and I know we can't stop them, but I think if we have people there to provide that support, they may stay. So, Mr. Speaker, can the minister tell me if the department has dedicated detox beds on its radar for Hay River? And if not, will she make a commitment to reviewing it and making it a priority? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Hay River South. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there is a gap in our continuum of service which relates to people who are ready for detox and facility-based treatment to have a safe place to live while they regain their sobriety and move forward with counseling and the application form to get into facility-based treatment. So what I would say about this is that the hospital is one possibility, but there needs to be a community-based possibility as well, where people have a safe place to stay, where they can access counseling, where they can use whatever therapy has been prescribed to them. And this is something that I think maybe exists in Yellowknife, but not anywhere else in the territory. So it's certainly an area that needs strengthening and which we need to look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know, when we're talking about people who are, you know, crying out for help, we have sort of the middle component. We have a lot of programming. You know, I don't dispute that. And, you know, and I try and encourage people to you know, to take some of that programming or talk to counselors. And we also have access to treatment centers, albeit that they're from down south. They're not here in the territories, but we do have that. What we don't have is the front end, which is the detox centers or beds. We need something for these people. You know, they need to be somewhere where they're safe, because a lot of times we're dealing with people who might be homeless. They don't have a place to live. You know, they got families kicking them out, whatever. So they need a safe place, and it takes this government to actually do something. It takes our financial resources. So, Mr. Speaker, after 6 confirmed drug-related deaths in the community of Hay River, to support residents requiring detox, we need the funding, $240,000 actually, for 2 positions, which would be medical social workers. Can the minister to tell me when this might happen, or if it's on her radar? Because my assumption was that it was something that was already going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Hay River South. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in fact, the Hay River Health and Social Services Authority is now actively recruiting 2 medical social workers who will support community outreach efforts and coordinate clinical care. So I don't know where that process is at, but the money has been identified, the ad has been posted, and it usually takes somewhere up to 12 weeks to fill a position. So I hope that before we leave here at the end of March, I will be able to announce to you that the medical social workers are in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Housing. Earlier, the Minister responded to my oral question from last session and mentioned 2 projects here in Yellowknife that are supposedly work of the department in order to combat homelessness. Can the Minister tell me how much money that the N.W.T contributed to those 2 projects, Lynn's Place and Spruce Bough, that were mentioned in the return to oral questions? It's my understanding that money was from the federal government, not the N.W.T and the 2 NGOs involved. Can the Minister please speak to the N.W.T's contribution? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Great Slave. Minister responsible for Housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question as well, too. I actually just had the information in front of me, but I was more calculating the units for Yellowknife. That's what I had concentrated on. We have 366 that are being delivered now by the National Co-Investment Fund, but then we did support these applications going forward. Housing did create a position to be the outreach, to talk to NGOs, to talk to Indigenous groups, to gain their interest in addressing the housing crisis throughout the Northwest Territories with us. Working in partnership is a priority of mine as well, too. Right now, we have 214 of the 366 co-investment fund applications that have been approved. They are now under construction. Right now, you can see the expansion of Lynn's Place, Spruce Bough, Borealis Co-op, and Avon's Senior Society, also with a number of renovated units that are happening throughout the city. We also work with the City of Yellowknife as well to address homelessness as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't think I asked about the number of units. I asked the minister how much money, besides the one position that hasn't done anything, did the N.W.T spend on Lynn's Place and Spruce Bough? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Great Slave. Minister responsible for Housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I addressed the answer to the question. I said I did not have those numbers, that I was more concentrating on the number of units that were being delivered. I did have that in front of me just recently. I will follow up with the member as well, but like I had said, I wanted to describe our support for the co-investment applications going forward for the Northwest Territories. We did create support and a position within Housing N.W.T to be the outreach, to work closely with CMHC in addressing those housing needs and to support those applications going forward. We did get a funding from this government to be addressing the National Co-Investment Fund applications as well too. Sometimes the proponent comes forward as well and they're not looking for financial support. They're looking for support through the application as well too. Some of them actually do have the means to bring their applications forward, but I will follow up with the member as well to justify the numbers and what we've financially contributed to these 214 units being constructed now here in Yellowknife. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to have given the minister an opportunity for a minister's statement there when she still did not answer my question or say that at the beginning of the first response. If she couldn't answer that, can she tell me how does she make decisions regarding the homelessness strategy and areas for funding, etc., when she doesn't collect any data about the people that are homeless or struggling in the Northwest Territories? Can the minister tell me how she plans to address the fact that she has no data on who is homeless in the territory when she presents her homelessness strategy? Thank you.
Thank you, Member. I believe that's a different line of questions than what you started with, but for the next time, we'll be a little more strict on that. Member for Housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Speaker, for that as well too. Right now, we've recognized that the homelessness strategy is an all-of-a-government approach. We are looking at the needs that are specifically identified as well too, addressing the poverty reduction, the food security, mental health, and addictions, and also looking at the affordable housing and working more closely with our nonprofit organizations as well. This has been identified as a whole of a government, and we're looking at this strategy hopefully being provided to members by February 28th. And we did have the date that was identified as of April 1st, but I do understand the complexity of this strategy as well and the identified needs. For the data collection, this is something the government has not put together. We don't have those numbers. What I can do is work on the wait list that we do have throughout the Northwest Territories and the significant need for housing across the North. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank you for indulging my question. As I sit and listen to the fact that we have not collected this data and hear the minister explain that the housing wait list is what she's going off of, I think we're conflating two different issues here. Homelessness does not equate to the number of people that are on the housing wait list, especially when you have NGOs like the YWCA taking and housing people in lieu of the government doing it themselves. Given that there is no data being collected, and I've yet to see the minister come to my riding or any in Yellowknife that I'm aware of, could the minister please commit to doing a tour of Yellowknife apartment buildings in my riding and including Lanky Court? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Great Slave. Minister responsible for housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to look at our looking at our wait list. That is a contribution to the housing strategy. I said this is a all of a government approach. We are working with health and justice as well too, and I'm looking forward to the completion of the strategy as well. And also for the member to invite me to her riding and looking at Lanky Court, I'd also like to extend that to the MLA O'Reilly's riding as well too, because Lanky Court is in his riding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Colleagues, before we continue, we got to tighten up the questions and answers. We did 2 and it's been 15 minutes here, so we need to shorten it up here. Thank you. Oral questions. Member for Decho.
Let's see, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are related to my member's statement of Arctic Winter Games and how the department can increase participation of small community athletes in traditional sports and all the other sports there. Can the MACA minister advise as to what steps were taken to increase participation of small communities in preparation for the Arctic Winter Games? Listen.
Thank you, Member for Ditcho. Minister responsible for MACA.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it was very exciting to be at the Arctic Winter Games this year. It was the first time in 5 years that we've had it because of COVID and the situations like that. So the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs works with Sport North, the Aboriginal Sports Circle, Mackenzie Recreation Association, the Beaufort Delta Recreation Association, and the territorial sport organizations to develop and foster coaches and athletes in the communities. The department also supports the municipal or Sport North by having the MACA regional recreation coordinators work with the communities and identifying that there as well. We get that information out to the schools, so we're able to do those things collaboratively with education and our partners. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I note that the minister had gone down on public dime and he didn't invite the most important person, me. But, Mr. Speaker, I noted in my member's statement there were no participants from Kakiza, Enterprise, nor N.W.T, which is the River Reserve. I note that there are regional recreation staff throughout the N.W.T. Can the minister advise the regional recreation staff advise and assist the small communities, particularly the communities I mentioned, in preparation for the Arctic Winter Games? Merci.
Thank you, Member for Decho. Minister responsible for MACA.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think Emily Simler would probably say she was the most important person. She was there, and she did a great job representing the Northwest Territories there. So municipal and community affairs regional recreation coordinators are actively involved in sharing information to all the communities. That's with the rec leaders, that's with the SAOs or the band managers, so we get that information out there. I can also confirm information on the selection process and deadlines were shared numerous times. As well, we work with the schools to get that information out to the people there. Again, we place how you say, most important, getting the information out there. It's very important for us to stress the information, getting it out there, and we work with the regional associations as well to get that information to all communities in the Northwest Territories, just not the ones in the Mackenzie region, but we also get it to the Beaufort Delta Recreation Association. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for that answer. What I hear there is that they share, the regional recreation staff only share information. I think in my previous statements regarding sports activities for all the communities, and since the lag in time due to COVID and new recreation staff, it was impertinent and very important that those staff go out into the communities, and it hasn't happened. We got a lot of staff involved in recreation who are not going into the communities to offer assistance within the communities. You're only sharing info. That's just not going to work. Mr. Speaker, I understand there is controversy and dismay during the regionals held in Yellowknife in the past and a lack of proper facilities for attending athletes and their chaperones. This is all during the trials and preparations. Can the Minister advise as to why other communities outside of Yellowknife were not considered to host regionals or trials? Merci.
Thank you, Member for Decho. Minister responsible for Municipal and Community Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to have to clarify something here. Our regional recreation coordinators do go into the communities. They do work with the schools. They do work with the recreational staff. They come in when they're invited, when they're new, so they get into that there. In regards to hosting territorial events, yes, there was some confusion out there, but again, it got fixed. Territorial organizations work with the communities and to see if they want to host it, if they're able to do it, if they got the venues, they got the places, the accommodations for the food. It's been the practice is to host where communities want to host it and where they can be hosting it. Fort Simpson, in my 30 years in that community, we've hosted territorials and regional trials. Fort Province have hosted regional trials as well. So we do give that opportunity to various communities, and we will continue to do that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final short supplementary. Member for Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. I wish we could see a record of their staff going into the communities. I'm not aware of anything there. Anyways, I understand the Canada Winter Games are upcoming. I don't know the dates or the venue or which place it's being held. Can the Minister advise if, because it's a short period of time, if the same athletes that attended the Winter Games will be the same athletes going to the Canada Winter Games? Merci.
Thank you, Member for Decho. Minister responsible for MACA.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the 2023 Canada Games, Winter Games are going to be held in Charlottetown, PEI, February 18th to March 5th. So we do have a team coming from the Northwest Territories. Some of the athletes that did attend the Winter Games are part of the Canada Games team. There is a selection process, but there's a number of new athletes as well that are able to participate at that level. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My question is for the Minister for Housing, N.W.T. I outlined a myriad of problems brought to my office by constituents in public housing at Lanky Court. Can the Minister tell us why individuals being moved out of their public housing units to repair them are being charged moving expenses and utility account service charges, and will the Minister commit to reimbursing such unfair charges? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Housing, N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for asking the question as well. The information that I did receive is that the Yellowknife Housing Authority did pay for the moving expenses, and it didn't appear that there was any issues with the assessment of the additional deposits on their utility accounts. But if there is something, if there's receipts, if there's something that I could look at, that I could further look into this file as well too. I would not want to see the clients endure these additional expenses when moving from unit to unit as well. And right now that I'm looking at anything that we need to do to improve our client service with housing. I appreciate the comments coming forward as well, and it's the time for us to start recognizing how we could improve services. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that, and I'll work with my constituent to get the receipts over to the Minister's office pronto. But just trying to get a response in a reasonable time frame from the Minister on my constituents' concerns about public housing in Lanky Court has been a real challenge. I suggested several times that if public housing tenants are being told to move or store belongings for insect control, that cleaning products and storage containers should be provided. Can the Minister tell us why cleaning products or services and storage containers are not provided to public housing tenants to facilitate improvements in their housing conditions? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for housing and N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question as well, too. And I just wanted to apologize also for the delay in the responses. I did have a new team established within the last year, so we are getting more coordinated, and hopefully we're able to respond a lot more quicker. We are also, I don't want to take up too much time, but we are also working more closely with the local housing authority and improving our communication and our relationship with them as well. Right now, we do have some storage facilities that are provided to some clients, but it's looked at as a case-by-case basis. Just for an example, that one of the storage facilities were provided to a client that was in a Fort Garry apartment complex, and it was a cold storage facility that was provided to deal with the movement and also to house the tenants' belongings while the house was being treated for a bug infestation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that, and I'll advise my constituents that if they have problems with storage, getting containers and so on, they should contact the Minister's office. As bad as conditions are in Lanky Court, the Statistics Bureau figures are on specific housing problems reveal that about 10% of N.W.T houses have mold and or insect pest problems. This strikes me as a pandemic, Mr. Speaker. What public education and awareness measures does Housing N.W.T or community housing organizations take to raise awareness of these problems and give advice on actions tenants can take? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member, because I'm starting to recognize that this is quite a huge issue here in Yellowknife with the Lanky Court. We do have the pest control companies that do provide information as they are providing the assistance and the work in these units as well. Right now, one of the things that housing is developing is improvement with our clients as well too. So we're looking at educational materials for the tenants as well, when we're looking at what needs to be maintained, what needs to be recognized, and when to call our local housing authorities right away to deal with these issues. Another thing that I just wanted to mention is that within our conversations with the federal government, we were successful in receiving $60 million over 2 years. We will be committing $30 million of that funding to public housing renovation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Again, on mold, pests, and bad indoor air quality and other housing stats, the numbers show that housing core needs have steadily gotten worse from 2009 to 2019, and today it stands at about 24%. A quarter of our houses are not good. This government continues to spend far more on roads than housing. Can the Minister tell us when this government will spend at least as much on housing as it does on roads? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for his questions as well, too. And I do understand where he's coming from when we're talking about funding and trying to address the housing needs throughout the Northwest Territories. And we continue to work together as a government in trying to address these needs. But what we've done successfully is we've worked with the federal government as well, too, and really tried to enhance those federal applications going forward. And I've recognized that it's not all of a one government approach, and it's not only the N.W.T to address this crisis. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that we were very successful with the Indigenous governments and partnering up with them for them to receive housing money as well too. We also do support them with the community housing plans to identify the housing needs in each of the communities as well. There's a lot of funding that is out there, and housing tries its best to making sure that we do receive a bit of that federal funding coming to the north. I know I'm taking a little bit of time. The other thing that I'm just wanting to mention is that we did put forward another co-investment application as well to address the seniors' housing needs in the Northwest Territories, and we were successful with that application. So we'll see 12 new housing units for seniors that will be built for seniors, and their mobilization as well too, recognizing their limited mobility. Those would be constructed in 23-24. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Kamlik. Oh, sorry. Oral questions, member for Tunde-Welde.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the last year, I feel the Premier and Cabinet are now working together with the ordinary MLAs in the spirit and intent to resolve their respective community issues. In this consensus-style government, this should be a top priority to work together with all members, so all communities have a voice to be heard in this government, and that needs to be respected. From what I could see, this is not happening with this government. There is no consultation or accommodation with MLAs in small communities, especially for my riding. There are wants and needs for the respective communities. This is not reflected in their 4-year plan. Again, the N.W.T cabinet knows best for my riding. Mr. Speaker, my small communities do matter, and their voices need to be heard and respected. My question, Mr. Speaker, is to the N.W.T cabinet. I know the Premier's not here today, Mr. Speaker. The thing is that I'd like to get a commitment from Cabinet, the Premier, the Minister Caroline Wozniak, Minister Shane Thompson, Minister Pauline China, Minister Diane Archie, and Minister Julie Green, and Minister R.J. Simpson, to see if they could come to my riding in the first week of a break of the House, so that they are able to listen to the people in my riding, to their issues and concerns. And I just want to see if I can get a commitment here today. I'm inviting you, and maybe if the Cabinet could work together to either charter into the community, or we could figure this thing out, but I think it's important that we do that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Tunde-Welde. The question needs to be directed to one person, so I'm guessing that'll be Deputy Premier. Deputy Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we as a Cabinet have standing committee meetings on all of our different discussions, whether it be our bills, legislation. We sit in front of committee and we go through all all of our work in detail, and we get feedback, and it's a whole of a government approach with regular members and committee. In terms of looking to commit right now, for me just sitting here asking to go into the community directly, we'd have to individually look at our schedules. Right after we're done sessions, some of us have FPTs, we have community tours, we have bilateral agreements. I'm not saying no, but I think that we as a government could perhaps look at each of our individual schedule and respond back to the member. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Premier. Oral questions, member for Tunde-Welde.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for your response. Again, Mr. Speaker, I've been here a year, and there's no minister, no cabinet minister has approached me to say, what is it your needs are for your community and your riding. In 2019, all the MLAs got together. They are able to put everything on the table and what they want to see for their riding, and they came up with a mandate for this government. Again, I was never given an opportunity to have a say what should be in that mandate as well. So, we've been advocating for winter roads, dust control, additions, schools and data, and so on. But the thing is, I know Cabinet is busy, and I'm just saying that if there's a way that we could have the Cabinet come to our community. Deta and Dilo is just down the road. We'd be there in 20 minutes. We could fly to Tutsuke. We could be there. If we go there by charter, in and out, we could do forward resolution and so on. So anyways, I'd just like to see if there's a way we could work together to accommodate that. This is a request on behalf of the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Tunde Welde. Honorable Deputy Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, absolutely. We have requests often from regular members to go as ministers. Perhaps we've been to your communities several times as a result of your request to us. We've gone to some of the other ridings as a request of the members. I encourage the member to reach out to our ministerial offices, find a schedule that works for all of us, or perhaps even a couple of us. I mean, we all can't sometimes make it all together, but we will give it some effort to be able to get to some of the communities when and where we can. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Deputy Premier. For the record, we haven't seen you since last year. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. Oral questions. Member for Trinity Welde.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, and I'll reach out to the Cabinet and by email and see if we could try to work together to come up with a date to go into those communities, because I think it's very important that we do that. Mr. Speaker, earlier I had mentioned that there's, and I heard the Minister of Housing talk about that $30 million that they're looking at putting back into housing. But that $30 million over 2 years it's coming from CERNAC to deal with housing crisis. And in my riding, we have a housing crisis already, and we have housing issues. So I want to know if we are able to work with the government to look at how we could use that money to go back into the communities here in the Northwest Territories. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Tunde Welde, but your line of questions needs to be to your invitation for Cabinet. We can't go to another line of questioning for a different minister. Member for Tunde Welde.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'll have to ask these questions tomorrow then, because they are important. The monies that we're talking about from CERNAC are $30 million over 2 years, but that money was spent to fix on public housing. We still have housing crisis in Northwest Territories, and the money that's been used to address these issues were never addressed. So what I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, is that tomorrow I'll bring this up and say, hey, look, we got to work with the Indigenous government to talk about how we should actually do a contribution agreement with the Indigenous government to spend that $30 million. So I'll talk about that tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. We may have a chance later today, but I doubt it. But just a thought. Oral questions. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Health and Social Services. Mr. Speaker, this time last year when I spoke to the Minister about rehabilitation services, including speech-language pathology, the Minister advised that Health recently reorganized the delivery of speech services to focus on children from birth to 5 years of age. How has this change impacted service delivery in the last year, and how has it changed wait times for speech-language pathology? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Cam Lake. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for that question. So last year, we did reorganize services on the basis that the service provided within the schools is advisory and not therapy. The service provided within the clinics is therapy, and we prioritize the youngest children for that therapy so that they have the best success when they do begin school. Having said that, we have had and continue to have significant staff vacancies in both the in-school and the occupational therapy services. And so as a result, they were reduced for this school year. In-school consultative services will be maintained for students with priority needs, and those are primarily students under 5 years of age and students with complex needs. So we've added a number of new positions in the Delta and at Stanton with the hope of, not only the hope, but the intention of reducing the average wait time of what we're going for is reduction of an average wait time to less than 2 months. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister mentioned that the current service model focuses primarily on children that are birthed to 5 years of age. And we know that typically at about age 6, children age out of the system and the model that they switch to a consultation model at age 6. So given the impacts of COVID-19, is Health and Social Services looking to increase or remove this age out limit to increase access to services in our community schools? And that includes in Yellowknife here. Thank you.
Member for Kamloops, Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're not looking at making that change.
Minister. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Mr. Speaker, given that there is a national shortage of speech-language pathologists, is Health working with ECE to create a hybrid model of partnerships, resident speech-language pathologists, and community-based paraprofessionals to provide the much-needed on-the-ground support in our community schools? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as the member knows, NTHSSA and the department do work collaboratively with ECE in this area. And in the next fiscal year, the department is preparing for a review specifically of the speech-language pathology services to understand the current service gaps and identify opportunities to improve services. And that work will include NTHSSA, Hay River Health and Social Services Authority, the Clecho Community Services Agency, and ECE. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last year I asked that the wait times for rehabilitative services like OT, PT, and speech be publicly reported. The Minister shared an interest in advocating for greater transparency of wait times. So can the Minister share any updates on if and when this type of reporting will be available in real time, like an online dashboard? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we do have a high-level service dashboard that is available online, but it doesn't drill into the level that the member is asking for. And so I will follow up with her to give her specific times for Inuvik, Stanton, and Fort Smith. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's quite clear that the scope of practice of our pharmacists has fallen well behind the rest of Canada, and whether that be for emergency prescriptions, prescriptions for minor ailments, adapting and managing prescriptions, ordering lab tests, there's all sorts of things that pharmacists can do in the rest of Canada that they can't do here. So my question for the Minister of Health is, will we expand the scope of practice for our pharmacists? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are aware that the practice of pharmacy has expanded since our Pharmacy Act had a last substantial overhaul, and that pharmacists are able to deliver a greater scope of practice than they have historically. and that includes administering specific medications as well as prescribing them, which would be a huge help as things stand now. So we are planning to draft regulations to bring pharmacists into the Health and Social Services Professions Act, and to do that work early in the life of the next Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Mumfui.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as a method to reduce arrears, can the minister commit to establishing a periodic verification of income options for tenants? Thank you.
Member for Mumfui, Minister responsible for Housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to follow up with the member as well. I'd like to follow up with the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Mumfui.
Thank you. What local housing organization staff training is required on culturally respectful communication and developing relationship with Indigenous people? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Mumfui, Minister responsible for Housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. And my apologies that I just requested to follow up with the member because I didn't. I just needed the question to be clarified, but I'll follow up with her separately. Thank you. Right now, we are going through a policy review right throughout housing. We've got 41 policy reviews that are currently happening. Cultural sensitivity is something that will be included in the training for the local housing authorities as well. During this time that I've had the portfolio, I've also recognized language barriers were also an issue, so that will also be addressed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Mumfui.
Thank you. According to the 2021 Northwest Territories Housing Corporation annual report, renter arrears were forgiven in Betchako and N.W.T. Why were no arrears forgiven in Wikwiti and Gamity? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Mumfui, Minister responsible for Housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the member for asking the question as well, too, because we do go through a lengthy process when we're looking at forgiving accounts. They usually would have to do with very extreme circumstances and situations. I can follow up with the member as well, too, for just a further description on how that process works. We also have to abide by and report to Department of Finance and to this government as well, too. There is a lengthy process for us to be looking at those accounts. Some of them are denied and some of them are approved. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Mumfui.
Mr. Speaker, majority of the Indigenous people are living in public unit. Therefore, it is important for housing employees to be Indigenous. I want to ask the Minister, what are they doing to build the capacity? What is the Housing N.W.T. doing to build their capacity? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Mumfui, Minister responsible for Housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And also, I just want to comment too that, the numbers that we do have for Indigenous employees is quite high throughout housing. We do have the local housing authorities as well in the smaller communities. Majority of our budget is allocated to smaller communities. Also here in headquarters, I don't have the number with me on hand, but I can also provide that further information to the member as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Haver South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, these questions are for the Minister of Health. I'd like to ask the Minister, who funded the 2 medical worker positions? Was it new funding through this government, or was it reprofiled from within existing Hay River Health and Social Services budget? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Haver South, Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my understanding is that the Hay River Health and Social Services Authority has been able to fund these positions with internal funds at this point, but that they are looking for a longer-term solution to continue funding the medical social workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yeah, that's my understanding that they were reprofiled and that the positions are probably only going to be for 1 year, maybe. And I'd like to see, I guess, multi-year funding for it. So I'm hoping that, you know, the minister will look at that. And I'd ask her if the department is actually looking at funding for those two positions so that they are ongoing and multi-year. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Hay River South. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't have information on what the department has for an ask. I haven't seen that yet, but it's very unusual for us to offer a position like that for only 1 year. It's also very difficult to recruit people for a job that's only for 1 year. So my expectation is that that the department is looking at other ways to fund this on a permanent basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, considering that these are medical social worker positions, will they be considered, I guess, more of an outreach service, allowing for the workers to actually meet clients outside of a hospital setting? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Hay River South. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a better description of these positions is adult social workers, adult services social workers. So my understanding is that the operational situation for the two when they are hired is to have one available at the health centre and one who is doing outreach. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can the minister tell me whether these positions will be under the Hay River Health and Social Services Authority or under the N.T. Health and Social Services Authority? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Hay River South. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, these are Hay River Health and Social Services Authority positions.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I almost forgot to mention happy birthday to the Minister of Housing today. My next questions, though, are not for her. They are for the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. My first question, Mr. Speaker, is the N.W.T's response to the OAG's education audit contained an action item of to develop greater integration of services for children and youth in the education system through expanding regional capacity. This action item is currently on hold. What concerns me is the deliverables of this action item were to explore regional approaches to expand the current capacity of territorial-based support team, identify a pilot or demonstration site for the model to be deployed and evaluated, and collaborate with other departments to finalize a model for integrated service delivery that involves provision of services in schools. Given the importance of support services in schools, why was this action item put on hold? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Minister responsible for Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There was actually a pilot ready to go in the 2021-2022 school year, but like many things, COVID derailed that, and it was not a possibility to do this work. The department's efforts were elsewhere, unfortunately. Since that time, the approach to integrated services has changed across government, and so we are looking at new ways to integrate our services in that new approach. Thank you.
Minister, oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I find it very hard to accept that response because there are other ways of delivering these services that are creative, out of the box, and that are COVID-friendly. There are tons of virtual solutions that are out there that a lot of school boards actually paid for out of their own pocket over school shutdowns and during COVID, so that students still had access to these very important services. But those funds came out of their own budgets. So my next question, Mr. Speaker, is during my member statement, I spoke about a partnership that Nunavut is using to deliver rehabilitation support services in schools, both in person and virtually. So is ECE considering a similar hybrid model? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Cam Lake. Minister responsible for EC&E.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member is correct that the school boards have paid for some of those services, and that is with the funding that comes from the Department of Education, Culture and Employment under the heading of inclusive schooling. And those funds are restricted for the types of things that the member is talking about. So we are providing the funds, and we're letting the school boards determine how they use those funds. And so there are those types of partnerships, but they're not at the territorial level, they are at the school board level. That being said, I think that in the long term, we need to evaluate how we provide services. The Education Act modernization will address a lot of that. Will determine the roles of the different entities. So that work it's a work in progress, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Cam Lake.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the Minister identifying that it is a work in progress and that ECE is still working on this. And I also appreciate the Minister of Health referencing that they are currently working on this with other departments, including the Department of Education. I think it's really important, and we can't still find ourselves in another decade simply looking at the fact that there's vacancies and saying, well, we just don't have enough speech-language pathologists, so we just have to make do. We're going to have to look at other creative solutions like these hybrid models, like paraprofessionals in communities and so forth. And so I guess my next question, looking at the Nunavut model, how it was facilitated through their Department of Education, not through their Department of Health and Social Services, where the focus is 100% on in-school services, not on services, especially where we have an aging population who also need access to speech-language pathology. And so I'm wondering from the Minister of Education, is this a service that should be provided through Health and Social Services, or in actual fact, should speech-language pathology for school-based children or school-aged children be delivered in schools from the Department of Education? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Cam Lake. Minister responsible for EC&E.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't think there's a straightforward, simple answer to that. There's a number of different things you have to factor in, probably 4 minutes worth of things that you need to factor in here. So you need to look at
Go ahead.
you need to look at the capacity within the Department of Education, Culture and Employment. If we are talking about ECE managing clinical staff, we don't have that capacity at this point. The member pointed out the fact that the Department of Health has a mandate to serve all residents, whereas ECE focuses on the school. So there is an argument that perhaps we need to be having we need to deliver services dedicated to students. All of that really is up for discussion right now as we redesign the governance system of schools. But there's value to every approach. I think the bottom line is no matter who's running this right now, there aren't enough staff, there aren't enough speech-language pathologists, there aren't enough people providing rehab services to provide the services we need, regardless of who is administering the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member. Oral questions, written questions, member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My question's for the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources. The department conducted a 5-week public engagement on a new Forest Act that concluded on December 28, 2022. No report on that work has been released to date. The summary policy intentions document made no mention of a public registry or what information would be made publicly available. To better understand what information is currently public and the number of authorizations and decisions made under existing legislation, please provide the following. 1, the number of instances where decisions and authorizations have been made under the Forest Management Act for each of the last 5 years related to A, Section 2, appointments of a forest management supervisor, B, Section 4, appointments of forest management officers, C, Section 8, transfer of forests to Canada, D, Section 9, forest management agreements, E, Section 10, permits and licenses, F, Section 19, suspension of a permit or license. G, Section 21, written notices, written reasons for the suspension of a permit or license. H, Section 22, notices of appeal. I, Section 28, ministerial decisions on appeals. And J, Section 30, enforcement orders. 2, the number of instances where decisions and authorizations have been made under the Forest Protection Act for each of the last 5 years related to A, Section 16, appointments of a forest supervisor. B, Section 17, appointments of forest officers. C, Section 19, directions, demands, and notices issued by the forest supervisor. And D, Section 21, permits issued. 3, for each of the items listed in 1 and 2, please indicate where these documents are publicly available without resort to Access to Information and Protection Privacy Act, and where the public can access them. 4, an explanation of how the department intends to implement the provisions of the open government policy approved by the Executive Council January 8, 2018 as part of the new Forest Act, especially regarding open by design information and decision making, increased transparency, and public participation in decision making. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Written questions, written questions. Returns to written questions. Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, I have a return to written question 48-19, asked by the member for Great Slave on October 26th to the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment regarding delivering the Child and Youth Care Counselor Program. Mr. Speaker, I have a return to written question 49-19-2, asked by the member for Great Slave on October 26, 2022 regarding delivering the Child and Youth Care Counselor Program. Mr. Speaker, I have a return to written question 50-19-2, asked by the member for Cam Lake to the Minister of Health and Social Services on October 31st, 2022 regarding treating infertility. Mr. Speaker, I have a return to written question 51-19-2, asked by the member for Decho on October 31st, 2022 to the Minister of Housing Northwest Territories regarding Housing Northwest Territories offloading housing units to First Nations. Mr. Speaker, I have a return to written question 52-19-2, asked by the member for Decho on November 1st, 2022 to the Minister of Infrastructure regarding the Settlement Maintainers Training Program. Mr. Speaker, I have a return to written question 53-19-2, asked by the member for Cam Lake on November 1st, 2022 regarding the Northwest Territories Power Corporation to facilitate alternative energy. Mr. Speaker, I have a return to written question 54-19-2, asked by the member for Nunakput on November 3rd, 2022 to the Minister of Finance regarding carbon tax and the cost of living. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Returns to written questions, returns to written questions. Replies to the Commissioner's address, replies to the Commissioner's address. Petitions, petitions. Tabling of documents, tabling of documents. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following 2 documents. Information for return to written question 49-19 brackets 2, 3-year turnover rates of child and youth counselors by region, and follow-up letter for oral question 1159-19 brackets 2, mental health and suicide. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Tabling of documents, tabling of documents. Minister responsible for Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document. Additional information for the return to written question 15-19 bracket 2, carbon tax and the cost of living. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Tabling of documents. Minister responsible for Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following 2 documents. Information for returns to written questions 52-19 brackets 2, Settlement Maintainer Training Program, and information for return to written questions 53-19 bracket 2, Northwest Territories Power Corporation to facilitate alternative energy. Kuya 90, Mr. Speaker.
Colleagues, pursuant to Section 40.23 brackets 1 of the Public Service Act, I wish to table the 2021-2022 Annual Report of the Equal Pay Commissioner for the Northwest Territories. Section 23 of the Official Languages Act, I hereby table the Languages Commissioner of the Northwest Territories Annual Report 2021-2022. Tabling of documents, tabling of documents. Notices of motion, notices of motion, motions, motions. Notices of motion for the first reading of bills, notices of motion for the first reading of bills, first reading of bills, first reading of bills, second reading of bills, second reading of bills. Consideration in committee of the whole. Consideration of committee of the whole of bills and other matters. Bill 2329. Minister's Statement 264-19 brackets 2, table document 681-19 brackets 2, table document 694-19 brackets 2, with member for Decho and the chair.
I now call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? The member for Cam Lake.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I ask that the chair rise and report progress.
There's a motion on the floor to report progress. The motion is in order and non-debatable. All those in favor? Resounding yay. All those opposed? The motion is carried. I will now rise and report progress. Merci.
May I please have the report of Committee of the Whole, member for Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Your committee has been considering Bill 23, Bill 29, Minister's Statement 624, 19, brackets 2, table document 681-19 brackets 2, and table document 694 19 brackets 2, and would like to report progress. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with. Merci.
For Decho, do we have a seconder? Member for the N.W.T. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion's carried. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Wednesday, February 8th, 2023, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, budget address, minister statements, member statements. Returns to oral questions, oral question 1188-19-2. Acknowledgements, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to commissioner's address, petitions, reports of committees and the review of bills, reports of standing and special committees, tabling of documents, notices of motion, motions, notices of motion for first reading of bills, second reading of bills, Bill 64, Consideration in Committee of the Whole of Bills and Other Matters, Bills 23 and 29, Minister's Statement 264-19-2, Table Documents 681-19-2, and Table Documents 694-19-2, Report of Committee of the Whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. This House stands adjourned until Wednesday, February 8th, 2023 at 1:30 p.m.
Order!